Well, we have another map scout video for you. This one is from Oklahoma. He sent in his map. Brody got back to him, looked at it, and he said we could use it in the video. So we have a map scout coming for you. So thanks for sending in your maps from the last video that we did. We got a bunch of maps in, and we're pretty much caught up. There might be 2-3 people yet. So if you sent your map in or just sent it in, it's the 13th today. So if you just sent it in, we haven't got to it yet. But we'll be caught up with all those maps pretty soon. So make sure. And for the people who send us maps and we sent you something back, keep us up to date with what you find, what happens this fall, what you want to see, what bucks you see, what bucks you shoot, what goes on. If you need any more help, just send us a message back.
Yep, and if you send us a map in and you haven't got anything back or you didn't get a response that says, yep, we'll take a look at it, thanks for sending it in, just send us a reminder email so we don't skip over you.
Yep, so we got a northeastern Oklahoma map scout for you. This is an Oklahoma map scout along, I think it's actually a river, it's too big to be a creek. Along a river there, there's kind of river bottom farm country type habitat you can see there in the map. Brody actually is the one that looked at the map and got back to the guy, so I'll let you start with whatever point you want to start with and we can go from there.
Yep, so I guess I'll just start in a broad view here. We had a broad view. I kind of marked just a bunch of stuff, and our approach to scouting is to kind of not exactly find specific trees that we're going to. We find areas that we're either going to go in and hang and hunt and then focus things down further or go in and scout. And so I just kind of broke stuff down here and started on the southern, very southern side of this property here and picked out the transition. I don't know if you can see it on your map. Kind of, there's a clump of trees to the left there, the bottom left, and you can see a transition that runs right there. That's just an area to look at. Like, there's no guarantees that, yep, transition, that's where there's going to be something, but that's somewhere that he can easily get to and scout and see if there's anything bedded or walking along that transition line. And then also, there's some buck bedding on the opposite corner there. So you can see kind of some lone trees inside some marsh grass. And if you go back and look on Google Earth to some of the older images, that used to be a field that they planted stuff in, and now it's grown up in like CRP type grass. So that stuff just jumps out right away, finding those lone trees in that CRP grass. So I marked that down as buck bedding, and that's one of those things, very easy in that spot to go in, do a hang and hunt, just hang on the very edge of that and see if you don't see anything stand up, or if you have the time yet in the summer or during the off season to go look for beds in that spot. You find one, you know right where he is, kind of probably one buck in that area type of thing.
Yeah, a lot of times those lone trees, I know I've mentioned this to the people that I've done the map scouts for, those lone trees, whether it be in the middle of swamp ground or CRP type grass, are great places for bucks to bed, and they're really easy to go in and scout quick and see if there's even bucks or deer bedding there, and you'll know real quick if there is or there isn't, because you should be able to see beds under the majority of those trees. And if you're not, well, then you can move on and cross it off, but something real quick to go in that usually has a high probability of having buck beds. So it's just something real quick to go to mark off your list or mark as a spot to go to.
And it's as simple as just going to those trees, seeing if you see beds and rubs in them, and then once you do, then you can figure out your plan for hunting it. And during the season, like now, might be too late to go in there and scout. If you don't want to go in there and bump stuff out, just plan on doing a hang and hunt one evening right there too, or velvet scouting that field. If you see them coming from that way, then you know right where they're probably coming from.
Yep. You want to move on now to the next thing, where really when I look at a map, it's just things that jump out to me. That's where I go to. So you want to kind of just move on to that next thing that jumped out to you there real quick?
Yep. So this is, I thought Oklahoma's kind of unique just looking at this map, because it's kind of a mix of the river bottoms that we hunt here in Nebraska, and then kind of a mix of land in Kansas too. But one thing that you always look for in kind of these Midwestern areas is these little fence rows or rows of trees, and there's one on the left side there that kind of just juts out into that field. And again, it's just as simple as going to these places and looking and marking them off if there's nothing there. So that's why we mark all these places down. When we scout, it'd be as simple as going through there, hitting that transition. We'd walk that transition that you see that we talked about earlier, and then we go up, look in that fence row, and keep moving on. So it's as simple as just going to these spots, marking them off, or saying, yes, we need to come back here. But fence rows, again, good place to hang a camera if you see bucks coming in and out of them. Good place for there too, because there's just CRP on both sides. So it's not ag field in this case, but it's good CRP grass, good browse for that buck. So again, just going there, looking for beds in that fence row.
And there's a couple fence rows here to the eastern side.
Yep,
across the river.
I marked those as well.
Are just other places to go, and they look even better because there's more stuff around them, and they're a little bit thicker and a little bit longer. So, like Brody said, fence rows all the time are just someplace to go check quick. It doesn't take very long. There could be nothing in them, or that could be where the big one's living, but it takes, you just walk it quick. Like, it takes 2 minutes to go walk
and
them.
they're
You'd be done with
usually areas where other hunters aren't going, or places where you haven't hunted. And that's kind of what I thought about the southern side. It's like right close to the road, but maybe when you're hunting in there, he's going farther and going past all that stuff because it's right close to the road. So it might be the place where you don't ever hunt, and that's where they're going to be.
And the next thing that I know, if I had to hunt, if we're going out of state, you have 7 days to hunt, or you want to get on deer quick, and you're along any sort of a river that's crossable, that's not the Missouri or the Mississippi, or has like rapids in it or something, that's a crossable river deer can walk in, or that you know they'll swim across, it's not too deep, is this area just to kind of the northeast of that ag field. I would set up right along the edge where I can see the deer coming out of that bigger area of timber across the river, because I can see all the way up and down the river and see where the deer are crossing and where they're going and how they're moving. And then from there, you can really get a good pinpoint on the buck is coming out of here on this trail. So then all you gotta do is get on that trail and follow it back in. So when you sit along the river where you can see up and down both sides, that's a tactic. I know, like I mentioned, if we're going out of state, that'd be on a river property, that'd be the first place I would sit, the first evening or the first morning, because you can really see where the deer are crossing. And they cross those rivers way more than you think. I mean, Brody's seen like 40 deer in one morning back here just doing that, but they all kind of came out in the same different spots, like 3 different spots. They went up in like 3 different spots, especially where the bucks cross. Then you can figure out, just get on that trail that the bucks were coming out of and follow it back in, and you can get on the deer really quick. So that'd be my tactic. One of the things I would do if I was hunting this property is set up right along that river where you can see up and down both sides.
Yep, and that's one thing that we did on the property that we hunt last year on that piece of public land, was sit on that river, figure out where those deer were crossing. We saw where they were crossing. We were able to go in there, and I scouted it with Zach from the hunting public, and we found another spot where we always saw them crossing. So it's just a good place, like you said. Sit there, you can see a lot, observation sit, let it give you kind of a starting point of where to go.
And very quick, because if you go to sit in that timber, you can only see, 60, 70 yards, depending on how thick it is. But if you sit along that river, you can see, 200, 300, 400 yards. You can, because maybe they're coming out way to the south, and you have no clue. If you're sitting in the timber, you'd never see them. It's a really quick way to gather a lot of intel to get closer to those bucks quicker.
Yep. And if we move a little bit north of where Chance was just talking about sitting along that river, we can see more of those fence rows. So I pointed those out again. It's just more places to go. And Chance mentioned earlier, these ones are probably better than that other fence row. More CRP, more food, and just a little bit thicker cover in some of those fence rows. So again, going there and looking at them, scouting them. And I also marked all that CRP that's on both sides. So I would probably sneak in and sit in that fence row that's in between both of those, and then observe both sides and just watch deer stand up out of that CRP. And I think,
like, I could see a whole bunch of deer bedded in there. And that fence row, it's one of the spots you can see it in your head, and you can just see a big 5x5 standing up out of it. But you have to scout it to figure out if it is, but it has the potential.
Yep, that CRP grass usually is overlooked buck bedding because there's not a hill, where they're talking about bedding on the upper third. There's not a bend in the river. There's not, a fence row or something like that. Lone trees, sometimes if it's just all CRP, it gets overlooked. But bucks will bed in that. We hunted a property way back when that had so many beds in that CRP grass that really kind of turned us on to hunting over CRP just because of how much we saw them bedding in that. So don't overlook that. Like I said, for me, sneak in, sit in that corner of that fence row, try to watch both sides, see if you don't see anything standing up or coming out of the woods too.
And a lot of times with those CRP areas, if you get a really good Google Earth or Google Maps image, you can zoom in, and if there's no cattle on it, the problem we have here is people have cattle, so they make trails, but otherwise you can zoom in on it and you can actually find the trails. So you can probably set up on a really good trail going in the very first time just by looking for the trails on a Google Earth image.
Yep, and that's one thing the guys at the hunting public pointed out to me when they were teaching me some of their map scouting skills and stuff, is if you see like kind of a spider web of trails all coming into one certain area, so there's like a hub and there are a bunch of trails coming in and out of that one spot, that means there's probably a bed there because that's that deer's entry and exit trails coming from a bunch of different places. And so for me, this area right here in the middle of the property, and I told this to the person that sent it in, was probably where I would start. The habitat is really diverse in this area. You got food just across the river. You've got the river. You've got a creek that runs in between all those woods. Like I said, the habitat's diverse. You got CRP. You've got those fence rows. So this is a place I would start. And there's a couple of transitions in there, and we're always talking about transitions and marking those. That's the first thing I do when I look at a map, is just mark all those transitions, and then usually all those other kind of smaller points start working off of that transition. So I went through here, marked several of these transitions, and we'll throw that up above this and overlay it so you guys can see which ones we're talking about. But I marked those transitions, and I told him it's as simple as, again, going in there and scouting. So find the transitions on the map, then you can go in there and either scout your way in and hunt on it, and if you find buck sign, hang over it, and then once you find that buck sign, you can work your way back into that transition a little bit. You can do that when you're scouting too. So walk the transition, find the buck sign, and then follow it back into that transition for the buck bed. So you go from kind of broad transition and then focus more down.
Yeah, I mean, as far as transitions, the thing we want to say is that they're not all equal, I guess. It's all of going, once you find it, go in and see what you see. They're just starting points. They're great places to start, and that's how we look at them. Great places to start. Sometimes that transition ends up being where you want to sit. Other times you get on that transition and there's a major trail that breaks off and goes this way when there's a scrape at the end of it and there's big buck tracks on it. Well, then that just leads you off. But the transition is always where we start, and you can build off of it. So not necessarily where you go and sit all the time, but it's where you start.
Yep, and a lot of times that's what, if you're kind of, like I said before, breaking it down, start at the transition and then work your way back in there into different places based off what you see when you're scouting or what you see when you're hunting.
Yep.
Also in this area, it's hard to see in some of these images, but if you go to a fall image where there's not leaves, you can kind of see that creek that runs through there, and there's several of those kind of little S-curves that make those peninsulas. Those are good places for bucks to bed as well. So I marked a few of those and told him to kind of look at those. If you're going to go in there and hang and hunt, you might as well try to hang and hunt over one of those little, S-curves in the river as well. So you can kind of see some of those S-curves that work in there. Bucks will bed in those as well in that area.
I guess the next thing I noticed too is if you go just to the north of this, there's an area where the trees look a little bit thinner, and it looks like there's some CRP grass mixed into the trees. That is just an area that's different than any of the surrounding area, but then the whole area acts as kind of a transition just because it's so much different than the surrounding area. So those are areas that we go in and scout to, and that bucks like, because it's not like everything else. It's just different than everything else. So whether it's, more, like I said, thicker, it's steeper, it's got CRP grass, so the trees are thinner, but there's more CRP grass. It's just different than everything around it. That's always a spot that we like to focus on the map and at least go in and scout. And that's what I noticed about this. I was like, oh, there's something different about that. Well, the deer probably know there's something different about it too.
Even if you hunt a property in Kansas and that type of habitat that you found isn't very good, but if it's what's different on some other property, that's going to be the place to go and look. Like you said, what's different than what surrounds it is what you want to focus on.
I mean, because even you can use like our high wall, for example. Everything's flat. When you get that high wall, the deer are relating to it in some way, and that's the same way they're doing with this area. The deer are relating to it in some way. When you get such a difference, whether it be the high wall or a completely different type of habitat, that just makes it easier to figure out how the deer are relating to it rather than just a wide open same stuff. So it just gives you a little bit more to go off of to figure out how the deer are using it. That just something completely different, how the deer relate to it is easier to figure it out.
And again, it creates that transition. When you get all the same habitat and all of a sudden it's a different habitat, it creates those transitions again that we're focusing on. So that's why we pick out transitions too, because usually it leads us to those areas that are different from what's around it.
Yep, so if we went in to scout this, first thing we would do is walk that transition line to the south, and you might set up in the right spot, you might set up close to the right spot and go, oh, he got up over there, no need to move, but it's just a starting point. And that's the other thing with the way we scout and hunt, is everything's a starting point. We don't plan on hunting out of the same tree anymore anyways twice, unless we feel like we need another sit to see. We're usually sitting, moving slightly, moving slightly, moving slightly, not sitting in the same tree wasting sits when we didn't find anything, because that's something we used to do. Sit in the same tree way too long. If you're hunting public land and you got that mobile setup and you can do it, you have a tree saddle especially, you can move super easily. So just sit in a spot, don't see what you want, move. Don't waste your time on it. Keep moving around, and that's how you can get on them quicker.
Yep, because you might sit at one spot along that transition, and that's what I told him. He might sit somewhere, it's not quite good, but you move up 100 yards, and then you found the spot. You see a buck come out, then move back over here, sit there, and you just get closer and closer and closer as you get more focused when you get in there.
Yep.
So the next part that I moved to was on the north side, and it's that marsh habitat. That stuff always jumps out to me no matter what state it's in. It could be up northeast or it could be down here in Oklahoma, Nebraska. That marsh habitat is something that I always look for because I know bucks like to bed in it and people don't like to hunt it, because even if it's a small marsh like this, people don't know how to hunt it, and it's just swampy and it's wet and there's bugs, and the bucks go there because the people don't. So I always kind of pinpoint that marsh habitat. And again, what we would do is go in, walk the edge of that habitat where it creates that transition, walk that. That's where you're probably going to find the buck beds. look for lone trees and stuff in that marsh where there isn't a lot of water, and do hanging hunts in there as well, kind of in the same fashion. And obviously on years where there's a lot of water in there and not a lot of habitat, there's probably not going to be bucks in there. But if you get dry year, you got a little bit of water, enough habitat, some cattails and stuff in there, really good place for bucks to bed. Run those transitions too during the rut.
Yeah, and the key with swampy areas are high spots. So again, you're going to find those trees, and those trees are there because it's dry enough and high enough that they can survive, not be flooded, and that's where the deer are going to be. So a quick key to hunting swamps is find the high spots.
Yep, and if you look at it kind of right there in the middle, there seems like there's kind of a dam or something that runs through the middle, a little bit more trees. You can see the high spot with where the water's at. That's kind of the marsh, and then the focused area of the marsh where we would pinpoint and go to first.
And again, I guess we've moved up the river again, so you can see that bend in the river. So now here's another section of river. You can see how straight it is. I would sit right there where it meets, where I can see into that area. I can see the other side. I can see all the way up and down it, any deer crossing it. And my scent, especially on a low wind day, is going to get pulled right with that river, because it happens all the time with the river property that we hunt now. That water will take your scent with it. If you're sitting right on the edge, I'd sit right on the edge, and you're going to be able to see where and how deer are crossing that whole river. And you can see into that stuff, that CRP tree stuff that you think is going to be good. You're getting a 2-for-1 out of one sit, figuring out where the deer are. So just, that's, again, another place as we work up, we'd put another set along the river again and see what we see.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it earlier, as long as it's not like a really big, deep river. We hunt ones here that the water's like a foot deep, but as long as it's not too big, the deer will still cross it. Those are definitely good places to sit. And that's as simple as doing 3 hunts up that river, 3 different hanging hunts where you can see and pinpoint deer, and then you go from there. I mean, it's one hunt. Take 3 hunts, sit on that river, and get a good idea where the deer are moving on that property, and then you know what bedding areas they're coming from, especially if you've done some scouting. You see one cross, and you know he went up here into this chunk of trees. You know what bedding area is. Then your next hunt, you're right in there.
Yeah, it just helps you break down that bigger island of trees a whole lot quicker, because you know what trails they're entering and exiting, and maybe they're on the northern side, southern side. Just helps you break that down quicker, because you can see so much further.
And it's always more information, because even if you don't come back to it, but you remember, hey, in September I saw a buck cross right there, scouting in the winter, take that trail, you might find more information. It's going to help you and find more bedding areas. So we'll just make a jump across the river and look at this section of trees over here. And again, it's that same thing of transitions and then the habitat that is different. And we like to go back and look at the old images, so don't just focus on the current 2019 image. I like the fall images a lot without the leaf cover on the trees, because you can see those transitions, see the trails, and see what's different. So when I went back, I could see a transition on this left side here, and it's a bunch of different trees in there. I'm not sure what kind of trees they are. Seem like they're maybe cedars or pines or something like that, but it's a big clump of them right in there, and that's going to be, again, another bedding area, transitions on both sides of that you can hunt. But just going in there, scouting that transition, and most likely there's going to be trails that lead back in to where that different habitat type is, where those different trees are.
And I guess one thing I noticed real quick was, probably not going to hunt it outside of the rut, but there's a little section of trees that connects these 2 sections of trees. I'm not saying a deer's not going to run across this field to get to the other side, because he will, but if should be a good trail running right through there that you can set up over sometime November 15th and catch deer crossing between the 2.
Especially if you've hunted that field quite a bit in the past, and they kind of know that you hunt that field, the area where they're going to get from point A on the right side to point B on the left side, if they know you're in that field a lot, is to just skirt right around the bottom of that, through that corner, and then go up into that bedding area that I mentioned.
It's just a nice little pinch point with the field on one side, river on the other side. They connect right there. Field on the south side, it just kind of everything pinches down right there. If he's going left to right, he's probably going through there somewhere. You can get there and at least probably see him and move from there.
Yep, especially if he knows that hunting pressure's in that field. Good way to sneak around you without you knowing he was even there. So now I'll move down to this little secluded CRP field, which, by the way, I like that there's a mix of food plots with the CRP stuff. Like, I always like to see that good mix. I think we said it before, CRP is underrated, especially for big buck food. Natural browse.
In Kansas, there's like 3 trees and a fence row in CRP, and there's big deer everywhere. So CRP holds deer. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's tall enough, there's cover in there.
Don't underrate the natural browse that CRP can give you and cover. And if you look at some of the old images, and we'll show them here, you can see all the trails that are crisscrossing across this CRP field that are coming from the ag field, crossing that river again, which you'd be able to see if you did one of the observation sits. So many trails when I looked at the map again that I could see crossing through there that I thought that was going to be a good place. You can see bucks crossing, especially most likely they're coming out of that bedding area, crossing the river, and then coming to eat. So if you sit on the field, you're not going to see them because they're probably not going to get there until late. They're probably browsing in the CRP. But if you move to that CRP and then you can move yourself back in there, you'll get close enough to them.
And another thing, to set up along that transition, you can look out over the whole CRP field, see where they're walking, and see antlers moving through the grass. Hopefully, if it's not super tall, and just gives you another wide field of view to then pinpoint things further.
And with that river being in there, if you have the ability to, if it's low enough, walk with waders through it, or get a kayak, you can float up that whole thing and kind of transects that whole property. So you can sneak right up to that CRP field, put your kayak right on the edge of the river, sneak in 50 yards, and you're right up on that CRP field. Haven't made much noise. You can get in and out pretty easily without spooking anything. Do your observations, sit on that transition, and be low impact.
So that just kind of gives you an overview of how we would go about scouting. It's kind of a river bottom ag country, really good mix, lots of good habitat transitions and things to point out to you guys at least at what we look at and what we're looking at on a map, and then going in deeper. And so like Brody mentioned before, what we do on maps is not finding specific tree stand locations. We're finding areas we know we want to go in and scout or do a hang and hunt on and walk it until we find the sign, find what we're looking for, and then do the hang and hunt or go back in and do a hang and hunt later. So it's kind of a broad and then narrow it down. Even when we hunt, we're still in a wider field because we always feel like we need to move around within the area. So we find the area, then we move around within the area once we get to it.
And that's just the way we do it because that suits the way we hunt with being mobile. So if you don't hunt as mobile as we do, you're going to have to maybe adapt your map scouting a little bit. But if you're wanting to do the mobile stuff, bring that tree stand in, do hang and hunts, that's kind of how we go about map scouting, is being really broad, pinpointing a whole bunch of different areas, and then just bouncing around, doing hang and hunts in those areas like Chance said, and then focusing it further. Find the transition, then find where at on the transition, then follow the transition back in there, and then find the buck bed, and then figure out what trail to set up on the buck bed. So it's just wide, and it funnels down. Basically, get probably more aggressive than you are, because we thought we were aggressive, and we realized we were not aggressive at all. So get more aggressive, don't be afraid to bounce around, move to different spots, hunt spots where you're like, I don't think there's probably ever any deer in here. Go to those spots, and don't be afraid to just use those hunts as a way to bounce around and just learn.
Yeah, like you said, acquiring information. That is the main goal is shooting a buck, but right close behind it is just acquiring information every time we go in. There's always something that you have learned from your hunt, whether there's nothing here. Well, then now you can cross it off, and guess what? Now you only have 280 acres to focus on.
There's one less bedding area that he's not in.
Yeah, so then it's all, every time you go in, there's something you've learned that will make you more successful the next time.
Yep, and don't get discouraged if you don't see deer. Don't let the shows you watch discourage you and think you have to see a deer every time. We have so many sits where we're like, this is going to be a good spot in this transition. We go there, see a couple of does, or we don't see anything. But like Chance said, and we mentioned, that means it's just an area you can cross off and move on.
Thanks for watching. We'll have more map scouts coming up because we have quite a few to do that people send in that they're allowing us to look at and show you guys to help you guys learn kind of how we do it anyways. So that should wrap up this map Oklahoma map scout. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe and check back for more scouting, velvet scouting, and Ask Whitetail Instincts and map scouting.